August 17, 1943, 27,000 feet above Regensburg, Germany, Captain Robert Mitchell gripped the control yoke of his B-17 FAR bomber as black puffs of flak exploded around his aircraft like deadly flowers blooming in the thin air. Through his cockpit window, he watched three Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters rolling into attack formation, their yellow noses gleaming in the morning sun. The German pilots had every reason to feel confident. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. They were flying some of the most advanced interceptors in the world, capable of 380 miles per hour with cannons that could tear through aluminum like paper. Mitchell's Flying Fortress, by contrast, was a lumbering giant that cruised at just 182 miles per hour when fully loaded with bombs. To the Luftwaffe aces approaching for the kill, this American bomber looked like easy prey. What those German pilots didn't know yet was that they were about to encounter a weapon system that would fundamentally alter the mathematics of aerial combat. The B-17 wasn't just a bomber, it was a flying battleship armed with 12 Browning M2, 50 caliber machine guns, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute, creating overlapping fields of fire that turned the sky around the aircraft into a zone of mechanical death. The story of how the B-17 Flying Fortress went from a controversial experiment to the backbone of America's strategic bombing campaign began not in the skies over Europe but in a Seattle warehouse in 1934. The United States Army Air Corps had issued a specification for a new multi-engine bomber capable of carrying a ton of bombs for at least 2,000 miles. Military planners envisioned a defensive weapon that could patrol America's coastlines and intercept enemy fleets before they threatened the homeland. What they got instead would reshape warfare itself. Boeing Aircraft Company assigned the project to a team of engineers, led by Edward Curtis Wells, a 32-year-old aeronautical designer who had joined the company just 4 years earlier after graduating from Stanford University. Wells stood in front of a drafting table in Boeing's cramped engineering offices, examining preliminary sketches that would evolve into something unprecedented. The Army's specification called for a multi-engine bomber, which most manufacturers interpreted as 2 engines. Wells proposed 4. The decision to use 4 engines instead of 2 was met with immediate resistance from Boeing's own management. Philip Johnson, Boeing's president, reviewed Wells's proposal with deep concern during a board meeting in January 1935. His comments, preserved in Boeing's corporate archives, revealed the financial risk the company was accepting. 4 engines will double our production costs and quadruple our maintenance complexity. If this aircraft fails to meet specifications, Boeing will lose the contract and possibly face bankruptcy. We are betting the entire company on Wells's judgment that more engines equal better performance. The gamble was substantial because Boeing was already struggling financially in the depths of the Great Depression. The company employed fewer than 600 workers and had not secured a major military contract in 3 years. Spending company funds to develop an aircraft that exceeded the Army's requirements seemed like commercial suicide. Yet Johnson approved the project, making a decision that would ultimately save not just Boeing but influence the outcome of the coming World War. Wells and his engineering team worked through 1935 designing an aircraft that broke with conventional bomber philosophy. Traditional bombers were essentially cargo planes modified to carry explosives. They were slow, poorly defended, and expected to operate only with fighter escort or under cover of darkness. Wells envisioned something different. He designed a bomber that could defend itself. The defensive armament concept emerged from Wells's analysis of a fundamental problem. Fighters were faster than bombers and always would be due to basic physics. A fighter carrying only a pilot and guns would always achieve higher speeds than a bomber carrying tons of bombs and a large crew. This meant bombers could never outrun fighters. The only alternative was to outfight them. Wells proposed mounting multiple machine guns in positions that covered every approach angle to the air. Nose, tail, top, bottom, and sides would all bristle with weapons, creating a sphere of defensive fire that no fighter could safely penetrate. Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Nair, chief of the Air Corps Material Division at Wright Field in Ohio, reviewed Boeing's preliminary designs in March 1935. His initial reaction, documented in official correspondence, mixed skepticism with intrigue. Boeing proposes an aircraft with defensive armament exceeding anything previously attempted. The weight penalty will be substantial. The complexity is daunting. Yet if their calculations are correct, this aircraft might be able to operate in daylight without fighter escort. That capability alone would justify the risks. The prototype, designated Model 299, began taking shape in Boeing's Plant 1 facility during the summer of 1930. Workers assembled the aircraft from over 100,000 individual parts. The wingspan stretched 103 feet, longer than the distance the Wright brothers had achieved on their first flight. 4 Pratt & Whitney Hornet radial engines, each producing 750 horsepower, were mounted on the wings. The fuselage stretched 68 feet and stood 15 feet tall at the tail, but it was the defensive armament that made the aircraft revolutionary. 5 gun positions were installed, a single 30 caliber machine gun in the nose operated by the bombardier. 1 30 caliber gun in a dorsal blister on top of the fuselage, 1 30 caliber gun in a ventral blister on the belly, 2 30 caliber gun in waist positions, 1 on each side of the rear fuselage, and 1 30 caliber gun in the tail position. While later versions would mount the famous 12 50 caliber guns, even this prototype carried more defensive weapons than any bomber previously built. The aircraft rolled out of the factory on July 17, 1935. Richard Williams, a reporter for the Seattle Times, watched the unveiling and coined the name that would define the aircraft forever. When he saw the multiple gun positions bristling from the fuselage, he wrote that the aircraft looked like a flying fortress. Boeing immediately adopted the name for marketing purposes, though the official military designation remained Model 299 until the Army ordered production models. Test pilot Leslie Tower lifted the Model 299 off the ground for its first flight on July 28, 1935. The aircraft performed beautifully, reaching an altitude of 10,000 feet and demonstrating stable handling characteristics despite its massive size. Over the next 6 weeks, Tower and his crew flew the prototype through a comprehensive test program, steadily expanding the performance envelope. The Model 299 achieved a maximum speed of 236 miles per hour and demonstrated a service ceiling of 24,600 feet. More impressively, it carried a bomb load of 4,800 pounds over a range exceeding 2,000 miles. The aircraft didn't just meet the Army's specifications, it shattered them. In September 1935, Boeing flew the Model 299 from Seattle to Wright Field in Ohio for official Army evaluation trials. The flight covered 2,100 miles in 9 hours, averaging 233 miles per hour. The performance stunned Army observers who had never seen a bomber operate at such speeds over such distances. The aircraft seemed certain to win the Army contract. Then disaster struck. On October 30, 1935, during the final evaluation flight, the Model 299 crashed immediately after takeoff from Wright Field. Test pilot Major Ployer Hill and Boeing employee Leslie Tower both died in the accident. The crash investigation revealed that the crew had forgotten to remove the gust locks, mechanical devices that secured the control surfaces while the aircraft was parked. With the controls locked, the aircraft was unflyable. The moment it left the ground, it stalled and crashed. The accident had nothing to do with the aircraft's design, but it occurred during the official Army evaluation. Douglas Aircraft Company's competing design, the DB-1, won the contract by default, despite being significantly inferior in performance. Boeing appeared to have lost everything. The company had invested its limited resources in developing a revolutionary aircraft, only to see the contract awarded to a competitor because of a simple pre-flight checklist error. Yet the crash paradoxically saved the program. The Army Air Corps had been so impressed with the Model 299's performance during testing that officers at Wright Field refused to abandon the design entirely. They convinced the Army to order 13 aircraft as service test models under a technicality that classified them as experimental rather than production aircraft. This small order, designated Y-1 B-17, kept the program alive. Major General Frank Andrews, commander of General Headquarters Air Force, became the Flying Fortress's most important advocate. Andrews believed that strategic bombing would define future warfare and that only heavily armed bombers capable of operating in daylight could deliver decisive strikes against enemy industry. He fought bureaucratic battles throughout 1936 and 1937 to secure additional funding for B-17 development despite opposition from Army leadership that considered the aircraft too expensive and specialized. The first production B-17 set entered service in 1937 with the 2nd Bombardment Group at Langley Field, Virginia. Pilots who transitioned from older bombers to the Flying Fortress discovered an aircraft unlike anything they had flown before. Captain Harold George, one of the first B-17 pilots, described the experience in a letter to a friend that was later published in it. Flying the Fortress feels like commanding a ship rather than piloting it. The cockpit sits high above the ground, the four engines provide power that seems inexhaustible, but the most striking feature is the sense of capability. In older bombers, you felt vulnerable, dependent on luck and darkness for survival. In the Fortress, you feel ready for a fight. The early operational experience revealed problems that Boeing engineers worked to solve through progressive modifications. The B-17B model, introduced in 1939, featured a larger rudder for improved directional stability and a redesigned nose section. The B-17C added armor protection for the crew and self-sealing fuel tanks that prevented fires when hit by enemy rounds. Most significantly, the B-17E model, introduced in 1941, completely redesigned the defensive armament system. The B-17E replaced the small dorsal and ventral blisters with power-operated turrets. A Sperry Ball turret mounting two 50-caliber machine guns was installed in the belly, giving the gunner a 360-degree field of fire below the aircraft. A Bendix turret with two 50-caliber guns was mounted on top of the fuselage just behind the cockpit. The tail position was enlarged and equipped with twin 50-caliber guns. Additional 50-caliber guns were mounted in the waist positions and in the radio compartment. The nose retained a single 30-caliber gun operated by the bombardier. The total defensive armament increased to 8 50-caliber machine guns and one 30-caliber gun. The final major variant, the B-17G, introduced in 1943, added a chin turret beneath the nose mounting two additional 50-caliber guns, bringing the total defense 50-caliber machine guns. Some aircraft actually mounted 12 50-caliber guns after crews removed the single.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
30-caliber cheek gun as redundant. This was the configuration that German pilots encountered over Europe in 1943 and 1944, and it changed everything about air combat. But in 1940, as war engulfed Europe, American military leaders remained deeply divided about the B-17's value. The aircraft was extraordinarily expensive, costing approximately $240,000 per unit compared to $110,000 for a standard medium bomber. Army ground commanders argued that the money would be better spent on tanks and artillery. Navy admirals insisted that aircraft carriers and battleships provided better striking power. Even within the Army Air Corps, many officers questioned whether any bomber could survive in combat without fighter escort. The British Royal Air Force provided the first combat test of American strategic bombing theory. In 1941, Britain received 20 B-17C bombers through the Lend-Lease program. The RAF designated them Fortress Mark I and assigned them to No. 90 Squadron for high-altitude daylight bombing operations. The results were disastrous. German fighters shot down or severely damaged more than half the aircraft in just a few months of operations. The RAF quickly withdrew the remaining B-17s from combat and relegated them to coastal patrol duties. Air Marshal Arthur Harris, who would later command RAF Bomber Command, wrote a scathing assessment of the aircraft that influenced British bombing strategy for the entire war. The American Fortress cannot survive in combat against determined fighter opposition. The RAF tried daylight bombing in 1939 and 1940 and learned through bitter experience that bombers, no matter how well armed, cannot fight their way through enemy air defenses in daylight. The only viable approach is nighttime area bombing. The Americans will learn the same lesson we did, at terrible cost to their air crews. Harris's assessment seemed vindicated by the early British experience. What he didn't understand was that the B-17C model the British received was an early variant with inferior defensive armament. The aircraft had only 5 guns, all 30-caliber weapons that lacked the range and hitting power needed to keep enemy fighters at bay. The later B-17E and B-17G models with their 12 50-caliber guns would prove far more capable. But in 1941 and early 1942, most military experts agreed with Harris that daylight strategic bombing was suicide. Lieutenant General Henry Arnold, commanding general of the United States Army Air Forces, faced immense pressure to abandon the daylight bombing strategy and adopt British night bombing tactics. Arnold resisted not because he was certain daylight bombing would work but because he believed the Air Force needed to prove it could deliver precision strikes against specific industrial targets. Night bombing, while safer for crews, couldn't achieve the accuracy needed to destroy specific factories, refineries, or transportation hubs. The strategic effectiveness of air power depended on hitting particular targets, not simply dropping bombs somewhere near an enemy city. The debate was settled by operational necessity. After Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States needed to strike back at the Axis powers. The only way to attack Germany directly was through strategic bombing. In January 1942, Arnold appointed Brigadier General Ira Eaker to command the 8th Air Force bomber forces that would conduct the daylight bombing campaign from England. Eaker arrived in Britain in February 1942 with 6 staff officers in a nearly impossible mission to build an air force capable of bombing Germany in daylight and surviving. Eaker established his headquarters at High Wycombe, northwest of London, and began the enormous task of creating a combat force from nothing. Air bases had to be built or expanded to accommodate the heavy bombers. Ground crews had to be trained to maintain the complex B-17s in the harsh English weather. Pilots, bombardiers, navigators, and gunners had to complete their training and form into effective combat crews. Supply chains had to be established to provide the thousands of spare parts, millions of rounds of ammunition, and thousands of tons of bombs the campaign would consume. The first B-17s of the 97th Bombardment Group arrived in England in July 1942. Eaker watched them land with a mixture of hope and dread. Everything the Air Force had promised about strategic bombing depended on these aircraft and their crews surviving in combat. If the British were right and daylight bombing was impossible, the entire strategic rationale for an independent Air Force would collapse. The Army would be validated in its argument that air power should support ground forces rather than operate independently. The enormous investment in heavy bombers would be wasted. The first American heavy bomber mission of the war launched on August 17, 1942, exactly 1 year before Captain Mitchell would face those German fighters over Regensburg. 12 B-17s from the 97th Bombardment Group attacked the railroad marshalling yards at Rouen in occupied France. General Eaker flew as an observer on the lead aircraft, demonstrating the mission's importance. The bombers encountered no enemy fighters during the raid and all returned safely. The attack proved that B-17s could reach a target and bomb it, but the real test would come when German fighters opposed them in force. That test arrived quickly. On August 19, 1942, B-17s bombed the airfield at Abbeville, France. Luftwaffe fighters attacked the formation, and for the first time American gunners fired their .50 caliber machine guns in combat. The bombers claimed 3 enemy fighters destroyed, though actual German losses were lower. More importantly, all the B-17s returned to base. The mission demonstrated that the defensive armament worked as designed. German fighters approached the bombers, the gunners opened fire, and the fighters broke off their attacks. Throughout fall 1942, the 8th Air Force gradually expanded operations. Raids penetrated deeper into occupied Europe, targeting submarine pens, airfields, and industrial facilities. The German response intensified correspondingly. Luftwaffe fighter units developed new tactics specifically designed to attack B-17 formations. They discovered that frontal attacks were most effective because the early B-17E models had weak forward firepower. A fighter diving head-on toward a bomber presented a difficult target for the waist and turret gunners while allowing the fighter pilot to aim at the bomber's cockpit and engines. Major Egon Mayer, a Luftwaffe fighter ace who would eventually be credited with 102 aerial victories, pioneered the head-on attack technique in late 1942. He explained his tactical reasoning in a post-war interview conducted by American intelligence officers. The American bombers had powerful defensive fire from the sides, above and below, but the nose was vulnerable. Our fighters approached in line abreast formation from directly ahead at the same altitude. We opened fire at 800 meters and held our course until the last possible moment before diving under the bomber formation. This gave us approximately 4 seconds of firing time and presented the bomber gunners with an almost impossible deflection shot. Mayer's tactics worked. German fighters began scoring kills against B-17s with increasing frequency. The missions against submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire and Lorient in November 1942 resulted in several B-17s shot down. The raid on Lille, France on October 9, 1942 cost 4 bombers from a force of 108 aircraft, representing nearly a 4% loss rate. Military planners calculated that if loss rates remained above 5%, bomber crews would be unable to complete their required 25 mission combat tours. The entire daylight bombing strategy appeared to be failing. December 1942 and January 1943 brought terrible weather that grounded most operations, giving both sides time to reassess tactics. American commanders studied loss reports and combat film from gun cameras. They reached several critical conclusions. First, bombers had to fly in tight formation to create overlapping fields of defensive fire. Stragglers or aircraft flying loose formation were easy prey for German fighters. Second, more forward firepower was essential to counter head-on attacks. Third, fighter escort had to accompany the bombers as far as possible, even though current American fighters lacked the range to reach targets deep in Germany. The solution to the forward firepower problem was already in production. Boeing engineers had developed the B-17G model with a chin turret mounting two 50 caliber guns controlled by the bombardier. This modification essentially doubled the forward firepower and made head-on attacks far more dangerous for German pilots. The first B-17G models reached England in September 1943, arriving just in time for the deepest and most costly raids of the war. Meanwhile, Luftwaffe commanders were reaching their own conclusions. The American bombers were vulnerable if attacked in sufficient numbers with aggressive tactics. German fighter groups needed to mass their forces and press attacks home despite defensive fire. Pilots who broke off their attacks early allowed bombers to survive. Only pilots willing to close to point-blank range and hold their fire until the last moment achieved reliable kills. This created a psychological battle as intense as the physical combat. German pilots knew that closing to effective range meant flying through a storm of 50 caliber bullets that could shred their aircraft. American gunners knew that only sustained accurate fire would force attackers to break off before launching their weapons. Both sides understood that hesitation meant death for either the bomber crew or the fighter pilot. Captain Robert Mitchell, whose story opened this account, arrived in England in June 1943 with the 390th Bombardment Group. Mitchell was 24 years old, a former crop duster from Kansas who had learned to fly on his father's small farm. He had enlisted in the Army Air Corps in 1941, completed flight training in 1942, and spent nearly a year training on B-17 SEF before deploying overseas. He had logged over 1,200 hours of flight time but had never fired a weapon in combat or been shot at by an enemy aircraft. Mitchell's crew consisted of 9 other men. His co-pilot, Lieutenant James Sullivan, was a 22-year-old from Boston who had graduated from MIT before the war. The bombardier, Lieutenant Thomas Brennan, was 25 and had worked as an accountant in civilian life. The navigator, Lieutenant William Foster, was 23 and had taught high school mathematics before enlisting. The flight engineer and top turret gunner, Technical Sergeant Paul Anderson, was 26 and had worked in an automobile factory in Detroit. The radio operator, Technical Sergeant Raymond Burke, was 24 and had been a telegraph operator for Western Union. The ball turret gunner, Staff Sergeant Donald Price, was 20 and had been working on his family's dairy farm when he enlisted. The 2 waist gunners, Staff Sergeants Henry Washington and Charles Kim, all were 22 and 23 respectively. Washington had been a porter on the railroad, making him one of the relatively few African-American men in combat roles. Kim, a Japanese-American from California whose family had been interned, had volunteered for service to prove his loyalty. The tail gunner, Staff Sergeant Robert Hayes, was 21 and had been a mechanic in a garage before the war. This crew represented the extraordinary diversity and social transformation that the war created. In peacetime America, these 10 men would likely never have met, let alone worked together in a situation requiring absolute trust and cooperation. The war forced a merging of backgrounds, classes, and experiences that would have been impossible in civilian society. The B-17's cramped fuselage became a space where the son of Boston wealth and the son of Kansas poverty depended equally on each other's competence under fire. Mitchell's first combat mission, flown on July 2, 1943, targeted the submarine base at St. Nazaire. His aircraft, which he had named Prairie Fire after his Kansas origins, flew in the middle of the formation where newer crews were typically positioned for maximum protection. The mission encountered moderate fighter opposition and heavy flak over the target. Mitchell kept the aircraft in formation despite taking several hits from anti-aircraft fire that punched holes through the wings and fuselage. All crew members survived uninjured, and the aircraft landed safely back at their base in Framlingham, England. The experience gave Mitchell and his crew their first taste of combat but didn't prepare them for what was coming. The missions planned for August 1943 would test the entire concept of daylight strategic bombing against the strongest possible German opposition. The targets were deep in Germany, far beyond the range of escort fighters. The bombers would fight their way to the objectives alone, relying entirely on their defensive armament and tactical formations to survive. The morning of August 17, 1943, arrived with clear skies over England, perfect weather for what would become the most pivotal day in the history of strategic bombing. Mitchell and his crew were awakened at 0400 at 0 hours for a mission briefing that revealed targets deeper in Germany than any previous raid. The 8th Air Force would launch a dual strike with 376 bombers attacking two critical manufacturing centers simultaneously. One force would hit the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg, but another struck the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. Mitchell's group drew the Regensburg assignment. The briefing officer pulled back the curtain covering the mission map, and the room fell silent as pilots traced the red lines stretching across occupied France, over the Rhine River and deep into Bavaria. The route covered over 500 miles each way, far beyond the range of any escort fighters. The bombers would be alone for over 2 hours during the most dangerous portion of the flight. Intelligence estimated they would face opposition from at least 200 German fighters drawn from multiple bases along the route. Mitchell sat in his seat digesting the information while around him, other pilots whispered nervously. Lieutenant Sullivan leaned over and spoke quietly. "They're sending us to get slaughtered. We'll never make it through that kind of opposition without fighter cover." Mitchell didn't respond because he knew his co-pilot was probably right. The mathematical probability of surviving this mission seemed impossibly low. Yet orders were orders, and at 0900 hours, Prairie Fire lifted off from Framlingham with a full bomb load and maximum fuel. The formation assembled over England with mechanical precision, 146 B-17 stacking into combat boxes that created overlapping fields of defensive fire. Each combat box contained 18 to 21 aircraft arranged in a three-dimensional formation with bombers positioned at different altitudes and lateral spacing. The geometry ensured that any fighter attacking one bomber would come under fire from at least 4 or 5 other aircraft. The formation was both a defensive weapon and a bombing tool, allowing multiple aircraft to drop their payloads simultaneously for maximum destructive effect. The bomber stream crossed the English Channel at 0930 hours, flying at 22,000 feet through scattered clouds. American P-47 Thunderbolt fighters escorted them to the Belgian border, driving off the first Luftwaffe fighters that attempted to enter. At 10:20 hours, the P-47 Sage reached their maximum range and turned back toward England. The bomber crews watched their escorts disappear and knew they were now completely alone in enemy airspace with over 300 miles still to fly before reaching the target. The first major attack came at 10:35 hours as the formation crossed into Germany near Aachen. Approximately 40 Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 fighters dove out of the sun, attacking from the front and sides simultaneously. Mitchell saw tracers arcing toward his aircraft as Sergeant Anderson in the top turret opened fire. The twin, 50 caliber guns thundering so loudly that conversation became impossible. The entire bomber shook from the vibration of multiple gun positions firing at once. A Focke-Wulf flashed past Mitchell's windscreen so close he could see the pilot's face, a young man with blonde hair who looked terrified even as he pressed his attack. Anderson's tracers followed the fighter and Mitchell saw strikes sparking along the Focke-Wulf's fuselage before it rolled inverted and dove away trailing smoke. In the ball turret beneath the aircraft, Sergeant Price called out another fighter attacking from below. His guns tracked the target and fires that caused the Bf 109 to break off its attack run without firing. The coordinated defensive fire from 146 bombers created a lethal environment for attacking fighters. German pilots discovered that approaching the formation meant flying through a storm of metal that could destroy their aircraft in seconds. The 50 caliber Browning machine gun fired a half-ounce bullet at 2,800 feet per second. At close range, these rounds could penetrate engine blocks, sever control cables and kill pilots instantly. A single hit in the wrong place would send a fighter tumbling out of the sky. Yet the German pilots pressed their attacks with suicidal courage. Major Maxwell led his fighter group in repeated head-on passes, closing to within 200 yards before opening fire. Several B-17s fell out of formation with engines burning or wings shattered. Mitchell watched a Fortress from another group take a direct hit in the cockpit from a 20 mm cannon shell. The bomber immediately nosed over into a vertical dive, falling 22,000 feet in less than a minute before disintegrating from structural stress. 10 men died in that air, their lives ending in perhaps 15 seconds of terror. The fighting continued with barely a pause as the formation penetrated deeper into Germany. Luftwaffe controllers vectored fresh fighter groups into the battle as the bombers passed each successive defensive zone. Between 10:35 and 11:45 hours, Mitchell's formation faced 7 separate mass attacks involving 15 to 40 fighters each time. The bomber gunners fired continuously, their barrels glowing red-hot from sustained use. Spent shell casings piled up ankle-deep on the aircraft floors, and the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder filled every breathing space. Mitchell maintained his position in formation despite taking hits from fighter attacks and flak batteries. Prairie Fire suffered damage to the No. 3 engine, which lost power but continued running roughly. Holes appeared in the wings and fuselage as 20 shells and machine gun rounds punched through the aluminum skin. The hydraulic system developed leaks, and the bomb bay doors refused to open properly when Brennan tried to activate them approaching the target. At 11:52 hours, the formation reached Regensburg. Through broken clouds, Mitchell could see the Messerschmitt factory complex spread across several square miles of industrial landscape. Brennan struggled with the bulky bomb bay doors while simultaneously operating the Norden bomb sight to line up on the aiming point. The formation made its bomb run at 165 miles per hour, flying straight and level for 3 agonizing minutes while German flak batteries fired. Black puffs of exploding shells surrounded the bombers, and Mitchell felt the aircraft shudder from near misses. A piece of shrapnel came through the cockpit windscreen and embedded itself in the instrument panel 6 inches from his head. Sullivan was bleeding from a cut on his cheek caused by flying glass, but he kept his hands on the controls, backing up Mitchell in case the pilot was hit. Brennan released the bombs at 11:55 hours, and Mitchell felt the air. Es pronopen stube. Wells my pube, the promenstope, is promesses. The bombardier reported good hits on the factory buildings, though smoke from previous bomb strikes obscured much of the target area. The formation turned south toward the escaping German airspace by flying over neutral Switzerland and then across the Mediterranean to land in North Africa. This shuttle mission profile avoided the need to fight their way back through the fighter gauntlet they had just survived. The cost had been terrible. Of 146 B-17s that attacked Regensburg, 24 failed to return, a loss rate exceeding 16. Another 60 aircraft sustained battle damage ranging from minor to severe. Approximately 240 crewmen were killed or captured, representing roughly 1/4 of all personnel on the mission. The Schweinfurt force, which had launched later due to weather delays and thus faced even heavier opposition, lost 36 bombers from a force of 230. Mitchell landed Prairie Fire at Tel Aviv at 18:45 hours after more than 9 hours in the air. Ground crews counted 87 holes in the aircraft from fighter attacks and flight. The No. 3 engine was destroyed and would require complete replacement. The hydraulic system needed extensive repairs. The radio equipment was damaged beyond field repair, but the aircraft had survived, and all 10 crew members walked away alive, though Sullivan and Hayes required medical attention for their wounds. The news from other crews was devastating. Mitchell learned that 5 aircraft from his squadron had been shot down. That meant 50 men dead or missing from just his unit. Friends he had trained with, played cards with, and shared meals with were gone. The emotional impact hit him as he sat on the wing of his battered bomber, watching the sun set over the African desert while mechanics worked to patch holes and drain leaking fluids. Yet the mission had succeeded in demonstrating something crucial. Despite facing the most intense fighter opposition the Luftwaffe could muster, over 80% of the bombers had reached their targets and delivered their payloads. The B-17's defensive armament, combined with tight formation flying, had proven capable of fighting through to heavily defended targets without fighter escort. The loss rates were horrific and unsustainable for regular operations, but the fundamental concept worked. Daylight strategic bombing was possible. German commanders reached similar conclusions from the opposite perspective. Luftwaffe fighter pilots had fought with extraordinary bravery, pressing attacks despite murderous defensive fire. They had shot down 60 bombers in a single day, an impressive tactical victory. But the Americans had still destroyed significant portions of 2 critical factories. More ominously from the German viewpoint, the Luftwaffe had lost 27 fighters shot down with their pilots killed or captured, and another 15 aircraft damaged. Replacing experienced pilots proved far more difficult than building new aircraft. Major Mayer survived the battle and wrote a tactical analysis that was circulated among German fighter units. The American defensive fire is extraordinarily effective when their bombers maintain tight formation. Our pilots must break through this fire to achieve kills, but doing so requires courage that borders on recklessness. Every attack run means flying through streams of 50 caliber bullets. I watched 3 of my best pilots die today, shot to pieces by bomber gunners. We achieved a significant victory, but if the Americans continue these raids, the mathematics favor them. They can replace their losses faster than we can replace ours. The Regensburg-Schweinfurt mission became known as Black Thursday, though it actually occurred on Tuesday. The name reflected the emotional impact rather than the calendar. General Eaker suspended deep penetration missions for several weeks while the 8th Air Force absorbed the losses and reassessed tactics, but the pause was temporary. By October 1943, American bombers were again striking targets throughout Germany. The introduction of the B-17G model with its chin turret transformed the tactical situation. German pilots discovered that head-on attacks, previously their most effective tactic, now meant facing 4.50 caliber guns firing directly at them. The additional fire forced fighters to attack from less favorable angles where the bombers' defensive fire was even more concentrated. Luftwaffe loss rates increased while American bomber losses gradually declined as crews gained experience and formations became tighter. Mitchell flew 24 more missions over the following 7 months, completing his required 25-mission tour in March 1944. Prairie Fire survived the war despite sustaining damage on nearly every mission. The aircraft eventually returned to the United States in 1945 and was scrapped in 1946, its aluminum recycled into peaceful purposes. Mitchell returned to Kansas, married his hometown sweetheart, and resumed crop dusting, never speaking publicly about his combat experiences until late in his life. The final statistics of the strategic bombing campaign validated the B-17's design philosophy. Of 12,731 B-17s built, approximately 4,735 were lost in combat, a loss rate of 37%. This sounds catastrophic until compared. British night bombers suffered similar or higher loss rates without achieving the precision targeting that daylight bombing enabled. The B-17's defensive armament didn't make the aircraft invulnerable, but it made survival possible where experts had predicted certain annihilation. Luftwaffe records captured after the war revealed that German fighter pilots claimed approximately 6,800 B-17s destroyed, though actual losses were lower due to overclaiming common and aerial combat. More significantly, the records showed that defensive fire from B-17 formations accounted for approximately 2,600 German fighters destroyed with their pilots killed or captured. This attrition of experienced aviators proved irreplaceable and contributed directly to the collapse of German air defenses by 1944. The broader legacy extended beyond combat statistics. The B-17 proved that complex military systems could succeed when designed around realistic tactical requirements, rather than idealized theories. The aircraft wasn't the fastest bomber or the most elegant or the cheapest, but it was survivable, maintainable, and effective. Those practical virtues mattered more than any individual performance metric. Captain Mitchell, interviewed for an Air Force oral history project in 1988, reflected on what the B-17 had represented to crews who flew it into combat. "We knew the aircraft wasn't perfect, it was slow, it was difficult to heat at altitude, and it couldn't outrun fighters. But we trusted it because it brought us home." When you're 25,000 feet over Germany with fighters attacking and flak exploding around you, trust matters more than performance specifications. The fortress earned our trust by keeping us alive when everything we'd been told said we should be dead. That's the ultimate test of any weapon system, not whether it matches predictions on paper, but whether it keeps faith with the people who must use it under impossible conditions. By that measure, the Flying Fortress never failed us. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.